Chapter 1. The wind tore the scream right out of her throat. Gravity dragged Odelia down into the swallowing dark. The black forest canopy rushed upward, a jagged maw of branches waiting to break her fall. She had nowhere left to run. The rogues had cornered her at the absolute edge of the precipice, their bodies warped halfway between men and untamed beasts. "Take her alive," their leader had snarled, his yellow eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. "She does not smell human. The master will pay handsomely for this one." She chose the abyss over their iron chains. Odelia closed her eyes, waiting for the devastating impact. But death never claimed her. A grip closed around her wrist. It was iron-bound and brutally unyielding, snapping her descent to a jarring halt. Her shoulders screamed in protest. She dangled over the terrifying void, gasping for air as the freezing wind battered her fragile frame. Slowly, effortlessly, she was hoisted back over the jagged ledge. Odelia scrambled backward across the frozen dirt, her chest heaving. She expected the rogues to grab her, to drag her into the shadows and bind her hands. Instead, the clearing was utterly silent. Two eyes burned in the crushing dark. They were molten red, glowing with an ancient sovereign fury. A colossal shadow detached itself from the tree line. It was a beast of nightmare, shifting between the form of a wolf and something far more primitive. The rogues lunged, driven by a foolish, desperate instinct to protect their prize. The shadow wolf did not act like a frenzied animal. It moved with the calculated grace of a king. A heavy impact echoed through the dense woods. One rogue collapsed into the snow, perfectly still. A swift, overwhelming blow silenced the second. The forest held its breath as the remaining threats were eliminated in absolute, terrifying quiet. No unnecessary movements, no wasted breath, just dominant power asserting its natural right. Odelia pressed her spine against a freezing pine tree. The towering creature turned its glowing gaze upon her. It stepped forward, its footfalls making no sound against the dry leaves. The sheer weight of its aura pressed down on her lungs, making it entirely impossible to draw a full breath. It stopped mere inches away. The beast lowered its massive head. Hot, rhythmic breaths fanned across the sensitive skin of her neck. It did not bare its teeth. Instead, a rough, velvet nose brushed gently against her pulse point. The gesture was entirely possessive. An electric heat flared beneath her skin, sparking a terrifying revelation. It was not deciding whether to kill her. It was claiming her. She was nothing but a fragile mortal, yet this entity of absolute darkness had chosen her as its own. The violation of her free will clashed violently with an inexplicable, soul-deep surge of safety. The overwhelming scent of winter pine and dark cinnamon flooded her senses. Her mind, unable to process the divine terror of being marked by a monster, simply shut down. Odelia slipped into the welcoming dark. Warmth, that was the first sensation. The bitter chill of the black forest had vanished, replaced by the crackle of a burning hearth. Odelia forced her heavy eyelids open. A soft, golden light illuminated the modest wooden walls of a familiar clinic. The scent of dried herbs and boiling water filled the quiet room. A cool, damp cloth moved gently across her feverish forehead. She flinched, a ragged gasp tearing from her throat. "You are safe." The voice was a low, soothing murmur. Odelia blinked against the harsh candlelight, focusing on the figure sitting beside her cot. Thorn, the village scholar. He looked as fragile as always, dressed in a faded linen shirt that hung loosely over his narrow frame. His pale eyes held deep, quiet concern. His hands, though steady, appeared entirely too delicate for the harsh wilderness they lived in. "Drink this," he coaxed, offering a small ceramic cup. It will soothe the chill in your bones." The memory of the molten red eyes crashed into her skull. The suffocating pressure of the beast's claim still burned like a brand on her neck. A sob broke past her lips. The terror had nowhere else to go. She lunged forward, throwing her trembling arms around Thorn's shoulders. He stiffened for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened, a fleeting flash of profound agony crossing his features before he carefully masked it. Then, his arms wrapped around her, pulling her into a protective, grounding embrace. He held her as though she were made of glass, his touch incredibly restrained. "It was horrible," she cried, burying her face into his chest. "There was a monster in the woods. It looked at me. It chose me." Thorn did not speak. His hand stroked her tangled hair, offering a silent, rhythmic comfort. Odelia squeezed her eyes shut, trying to anchor herself to the fragile humanity of the man holding her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, seeking the scent of old parchment and ink that always accompanied the scholar. The scent of winter pine and dark cinnamon filled her lungs. Her entire body went perfectly, horrifyingly still. That scent. She pressed her ear tighter against the thin fabric of his shirt. She listened for the rapid, frantic flutter of a frightened scholar's heart. What she heard made the blood freeze in her veins. Thump. A slow, titanic impact. Thump. It did not race. It pounded with the deliberate, echoing rhythm of an apex predator at rest. Between each lethargic beat, a faint primal vibration hummed deep within his chest. It was a growl. The man holding her so tenderly did not have a human heart. He was the beast. She didn't scream when she saw the blood. She didn't even breathe, because the man she trusted was bleeding like a beast that refused to die. And worse, his heartbeat wasn't human. If that creature in the forest wasn't a monster, then what exactly had been holding her all this time? Chapter 2 is where the truth begins to break. If you felt that tension, you already know this isn't just a story. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because what she discovers next will make her question everything she believes about him. Chapter 2. Odelia slowly pulled back. She forced her trembling hands to release his shirt. The terrifying rhythm of his heart echoed in her ears, a phantom drumbeat she could not unhear. She swallowed hard, desperate to mask the rising panic. He was watching her carefully, his pale eyes tracking every microscopic shift in her expression. "You are bleeding," she whispered. A dark stain bloomed across the white linen of his left sleeve. Thorn glanced down, his features perfectly blank. "I slipped in the forest," he replied smoothly, "while searching for you in the dark. It was a lie." She knew it was a lie. The colossal beast had taken a glancing blow from a rogue's blade just before it had eliminated the threat. "Let me bandage it," she insisted. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. If she played the grateful patient, if she pretended she knew nothing, perhaps she could survive the night. Thorn hesitated. He studied her face for a long, silent moment before giving a single nod. He reached for the wooden buttons of his shirt. As the ruined fabric fell away, the breath vanished entirely from Odelia's lungs. He was no fragile academic. The scholar's disguise concealed an imposing physique, carved from rigid, unforgiving muscle. Silver-inflicted scars crisscrossed his ribs, like a brutal map of ancient wars. But it was the mark resting just above his collarbone that commanded her absolute attention. It was a jagged, unmistakable claiming bite, the permanent crest of a dominant alpha. She reached for a clean cloth, her fingers brushing his bare shoulder. His skin radiated an unnatural, overwhelming heat. The sudden physical contact sent a jolt of static electricity straight up her arm. A sharp caw shattered the silence. Pippin, the black crow perched on the exposed rafters, fluttered its wings aggressively. It nudged a heavy glass jar of dried roots off the top shelf. The vessel plummeted directly toward Odelia's head. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on a loose floorboard. She braced for a painful impact. It never came. Thorn moved, not like a scholar, like a shadow striking. His arm snapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, just as the glass shattered harmlessly against the floorboards behind her. "Got you," he murmured. The two words vibrated with suppressed, iron-bound power. She was trapped against him, her feet barely touching the floor. The dangerous intimacy of the moment suffocated her. She felt absurdly, hopelessly safe in the arms of a creature she knew was a monster. The intoxicating scent of winter pine and dark cinnamon enveloped her, scrambling her rational thoughts. She looked up into his stoic face, desperate to maintain her fragile facade. "The beast in the woods," she gasped, her hands gripping his rock-solid forearms. "It looked right through me." Thorn's jaw tightened. A solitary muscle ticked in his cheek. "Did it harm you?" His voice dropped an octave, transforming into a quiet, lethal rumble. "No," she shivered. She pressed closer to him, an involuntary reaction despite her terror. "But it marked me. I felt its breath on my neck. It was a towering, cruel thing." A strange pressure shifted the atmosphere in the clinic. Thorn exhaled slowly. His grip on her waist tightened just enough to assert absolute control. Beneath his calm exterior, a wild possessiveness clawed at his restraint. He was burning with a primal, irrational jealousy over the fear she harbored for his own shadow. "You are safe here," he finally whispered. His thumb brushed lightly against the curve of her spine. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed midnight. Then the heavy oak door of the clinic splintered inward. The wood fractured with a deafening crack that tore through the quiet night. Armed rebels flooded the narrow entryway. Their boots stomped against the wooden floorboards, weapons drawn and ready. Thorn did not cower. The illusion of the weak scholar evaporated instantly. He released her waist, shifting his stance to become a hulking barrier between Odelia and the intruders. He grabbed her wrist, dragging her toward the center rug. He kicked the woven fabric aside, revealing an iron ring set deep into the floor. He yanked the trapdoor open. "Get in," he commanded. There was no room for hesitation. There was no warmth left in his tone. The voice belonged to a ruthless king. She dropped into the pitch-black space below. The heavy door slammed shut above her, plunging her into utter darkness. Odelia pressed both hands over her mouth, muffling her terrified breaths. Above her, the invasion commenced. There were no clashing swords. There were no human screams of agony. There were only devastating impacts. The stone foundation of the clinic shuddered violently. It was the terrifying rhythmic silence of an apex predator executing a flawless hunt. Leaden bodies hit the floorboards with crushing force. The wood groaned under the shifting violent pressure. Then, absolute stillness returned to the room above. The silence was heavier, more suffocating than the violence had been. Odelia huddled in the freezing dark, her knees pulled tight to her chest, waiting for the trapdoor to open. A thick fluid dripped slowly through the microscopic cracks in the ceiling, landing beside her trembling hand. Then the scent drifted down, fresh, metallic copper. It was rich and sharp, weaving seamlessly into the deep, unmistakable aroma of winter pine and dark cinnamon, the exact scent of the monster in the forest. The truth settled into her bones like winter frost. Chapter 3. Dawn bled through the microscopic cracks of the floorboards, casting pale, fractured lines across the cellar. Odelia pushed the iron ring upward. Her muscles ached from hours of trembling in the frozen dark. The imposing oak trap door swung back with a hollow groan. She braced herself for carnage. She expected the ruined remnants of a massacre. Instead, the clinic was eerily immaculate. No bodies littered the woven rug. No shattered weapons marred the entryway. The invading rebels had vanished completely. The meticulous silence proved one terrifying fact. The beast above was not a mindless killer. It was a calculating monarch. It possessed absolute control over its environment. Even the coppery scent of danger had been wiped clean, leaving only the sharp bite of winter chill. A low, labored breath broke the stillness. Odelia scrambled out of the cellar. Her eyes darted toward the far wall. Thorn lay slumped against the wooden beams. He was devastatingly still. She rushed to his side. His breathing was dangerously shallow, a fragile rhythm that barely lifted his chest. The linen shirt she had mended just hours ago was ruined. Dark stains bloomed across his side, mapping a lethal sequence of impacts. Odelia knelt on the floor. Her hands hovered over his unmoving form. She stared at the precise angle of the damage. It was the exact spot where the towering beast in the forest had absorbed a rogue strike. The impossible truth slammed into her chest, stealing all the oxygen from the room. The frail scholar and the colossal predator were one. She was harboring the very monster that had haunted her steps. She reached for a clean cloth. Her fingers trembled violently. She pressed the fabric against his side, intending only to stem the deterioration. The moment her bare skin made contact with his, the atmosphere in the room shifted. A surge of searing heat rushed up her arm. It was not painful. It felt like coming home. Beneath her palm, the dark stains ceased their creeping advance. The damaged tissue seemed to knit itself together, responding to her presence with biological reverence. The life-threatening deterioration miraculously stopped progressing. Odelia gasped. She pulled her hand away in shock. Instantly, the damage split open again. The shadow over his skin darkened, his breathing hitching with renewed strain. She pressed her hand back down. The deterioration halted. The overwhelming reality of the mate bond settled heavy in her skull. Her touch was the only thing anchoring his life force. They were bound by something older than time, a primal tether that demanded proximity and surrender. A phantom current of electricity pulsed between their connected skin, singing a terrifying song of absolute belonging. Fear twisted into something sharper. It morphed into a bitter, consuming betrayal. He had let her cry into his chest. He had listened to her recount her terror of the very monster he became. He had allowed her to believe a lie, playing the gentle protector while harboring a sovereign beast beneath his skin. The deceit stung worse than any physical blow. "You knew," she whispered to the empty room. "You let me play the fool." Tears of profound frustration pricked her eyes. She pressed harder against his side, saving the life of the creature she should be fleeing. The intoxicating scent of winter pine and dark cinnamon wrapped around her. No longer a comfort. It was a cage, a beautiful, inescapable trap. She stared at his aristocratic profile, the sharp lines of his jaw, the soft slope of his pale lips. How could a man so composed house an entity of such absolute dominance? Her mind rebelled against the duality, yet her body betrayed her. Her pulse synchronized with his lethargic heartbeat. Her own instincts urged her to lean closer, to bathe in his overpowering heat. The phantom bond pulled at her core, a magnetic gravity trying to drag her into his orbit. She wanted to pull away, to run far into the snowy woods, but her knees refused to obey. She was tethered, claimed without her consent, yet reacting with undeniable submission. A sudden shift in the air made her breath catch. The temperature in the clinic plummeted. A suffocating pressure expanded from Thorne's still body, pressing against the walls, demanding total compliance. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lengthen, stretching toward the center rug, like grasping fingers. Thorne stirred. His chest heaved with a sudden sharp intake of oxygen. His eyelids fluttered open. The pale, gentle gaze of the village scholar was gone entirely. 2 feral, glowing red eyes locked onto her face. Odelia froze. The overpowering weight of an alpha dominated the small space. Every survival instinct commanded her to bow, to avert her gaze, to offer her throat. The sheer intensity of his stare pinned her to the floorboards. Thorne's jaw clenched tight. The violent struggle for control was visible in every corded muscle of his neck. He was losing the battle against his own shadow. The human scholar was drowning under the rising tide of the predator. A slow, dangerous rumble vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of a beast preparing to claim its territory. The vibration traveled straight up through the soles of her feet, lodging deep in her chest. His hand lifted. The movement was agonizingly slow, fighting against an invisible, crushing pressure. His long, calloused fingers reached for her trembling cheek. The heat radiating from his knuckles scorched her skin before he even made contact. "Don't," he whispered. The voice was fractured, a haunting mix of the man she trusted and the predator she feared. "Fear me." His control completely shattered. A guttural, dominant roar ripped through the quiet dawn, vibrating with absolute, terrifying possession. Chapter 4. The sanctuary fractured in a deafening, catastrophic explosion. Wood splintered like brittle glass, raining down in jagged shards. The clinic's ceiling caved inward, sending a suffocating cloud of plaster, ash, and frost cascading over the previously immaculate floorboards. The sudden devastation stole the oxygen right out of Odelia's lungs, leaving her gasping in the freezing debris. Before the dust could even begin to settle, an imposing figure dropped through the ruined roof, landing with a bone-rattling thud that shook the foundations of the small building. It was the rebel commander. He stood tall amidst the wreckage, carrying a spear that pulsed with a strange, dark luminescence. The air in the room instantly dropped to freezing temperatures, the shadows clinging to the weapon as though it were a living, breathing entity. Odelia stumbled backward, her knees trembling violently beneath her as the sharp winter wind howled through the gaping hole above. Thorne did not hesitate. The fractured feral panic that had clouded his eyes just moments ago vanished entirely. In its place emerged an ice-cold, sovereign command. He moved with impossible liquid speed, sweeping his arm back to shove Odelia securely behind his broad frame. The protective gesture was absolute, an impenetrable barrier between her and the encroaching death. Then, the very atmosphere in the room shifted. A crushing, titanic pressure expanded from Thorne's body, rolling outward in an invisible, suffocating wave. It was not the wild, untamed fury of the forest beast she had encountered in the dark. It was the calculated, overwhelming weight of a true ruler. The gravity in the room seemed to triple, pressing down heavily on Odelia's shoulders and forcing the rebel commander to momentarily brace his boots against the broken floorboards. The intoxicating scent of dark cinnamon and winter pine flared, sharp, lethal, and devastatingly dominant. The invader slowly straightened his posture, a cruel, mocking smile twisting the thick scar tissue on his face. "I must admit, Your Majesty," the rebel sneered, his voice cutting cleanly through the settling dust and the howling wind. "Your pathetic little disguise almost fooled my scouts. Hiding out at the absolute edge of the world, playing the role of a fragile, quiet scholar. It is a spectacular, humiliating fall from grace for the great Alpha King." Odelia stopped breathing. The words echoed in the small, ruined space, each syllable striking her mind like a physical blow. "Your Majesty, the Alpha King." She stared blankly at the broad, iron-bound expanse of Thorn's back. The quiet man who had meticulously sorted dried roots, who had allowed her to gently dab cool water on his mild fevers, was the supreme monarch of their entire kind. He was the apex predator of the realm, hiding in plain sight. "You abandoned your throne," the rebel commander continued, stepping deliberately over a shattered wooden beam, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "You drank the black blood of the ancient demons. You willingly corrupted your own soul, twisting yourself into that shadow-cursed monstrosity that haunts these woods. And for what?" The commander pointed a gloved, accusing finger directly at Odelia. "For a fragile, useless human." The revelation paralyzed her. Thorn had not been cursed by some tragic accident of fate. He had intentionally consumed the darkness. He had sacrificed his humanity, abandoned his crown, and surrendered his peace, deliberately inviting the lethal predator into his veins simply to stand guard over her in this isolated wilderness. The sheer magnitude of his sacrifice pressed against her chest, a physical ache that radiated straight down to her fingertips, making them go numb. Thorn did not deny a single accusation. He stood unmoving, an imposing wall of rigid muscle and lethal intent, shielding her entirely from the intruder's gaze. "Leave this place, Kaelin," Thorn ordered. His voice was a low, resonant vibration that commanded the very air in the room to obey his will. "If you take another step toward her, you will not leave this forest alive. That is not a threat. It is a promise." "I do not plan to leave without ending the plague," Kaelin retorted, gripping his shadow-laced spear tighter. The rebel's eyes bypassed the king, locking onto Odelia with a concentrated, absolute hatred. "Do you even know what you are, girl?" Odelia shrank further behind Thorn, her trembling fingers curling into the ruined fabric of his shirt. "She is innocent," Thorn growled, a dangerous, feral edge bleeding into his royal command, the beast beneath his skin reacting to the threat against its mate. "She is the vessel," Kaelin shouted, his voice echoing violently off the broken walls. "She is the anchor, holding the shadow curse to this realm. As long as her heart beats, the monsters will never perish. The darkness will continue to feed on our people, breeding more rogues, more death." The rebel stepped forward, the dark energy of his weapon humming loudly. "Her survival means the eternal suffering of thousands. If she dies, the curse breaks, the world heals. Her very existence is a poison to us all." Odelia felt the floor drop out from under her feet. The remaining air in her lungs evaporated. The vessel. The words repeated in her skull, a horrific, endless loop of condemnation. She was not just a random target caught in a political war. She was the source. Every rogue attack, every nightmare that haunted the Black Forest, the agonizing, bone-breaking transformation Thorn endured night after night, it was all anchored to her beating heart. Her survival was a cruel, devastating paradox. For the world to find the light, her light had to be completely extinguished. A crushing wave of guilt crashed over her, suffocating and cold. She looked at Thorn's brutal, silver-laced scars, the marks of his endless battles to keep her safe from the shadows she inadvertently sustained. She was the reason he bled. She was the reason he suffered the agonizing duality of man and beast. "Thorn," she whispered, her voice breaking into a fragile, desperate sound. Hot tears blurred her vision, spilling over her cheeks. She slowly uncurled her fingers from his shirt, taking a deliberate, agonizing step backward. "He is right. You have to let me go. If I am the cause of all this pain, if I am hurting you, you must let it end." Thorn slowly turned his head to look at her over his shoulder. His pale scholar's eyes were completely gone, replaced entirely by the molten glowing red of the alpha predator. Yet the expression on his face held no madness. It held an agonizing, beautiful, terrifying devotion. He reached back, his large, calloused hand wrapping securely around her delicate wrist. He pulled her flush against his side, refusing to let her retreat into the shadows. The static electricity between their skin flared, hot and undeniable, binding them together in a silent, unbreakable vow of possession. "Never," Thorn rumbled. The single word possessed the undeniable, absolute finality of a king's decree. He shifted his stance, shielding her again from the rebel's view. He stared down the invader, his chest expanding as he drew in a deep, steadying breath. "I do not care about the curse," Thorn declared, his voice echoing through the ruins with raw, absolute obsession. "I do not care about the throne. I do not care about the realm. I choose you, even if the entire world burns to ash around us. I will keep you safe." Kaelin's face twisted in supreme disgust. "Then you will burn with it, traitor!" The commander lunged forward with explosive speed. He hurled the shadow-laced spear with devastating, lethal force. The weapon sliced through the freezing air, trailing a ribbon of dark, crackling energy. It was aimed perfectly. It was aimed directly at the center of Odelia's chest. There was no time to pull her out of the trajectory. There was no time to summon a counterstrike. Thorn moved. He threw his colossal frame across the open space, deliberately intersecting the path of the lethal weapon. The impact echoed through the ruined clinic like a dry thunderclap. The spear struck Thorn squarely in the chest. There was no explicit gore, no gruesome display of injury. There was only the horrifying, absolute silence of the strike, followed immediately by the violent surge of dark magic. The shadow energy exploded outward upon impact, a shockwave of freezing pressure that knocked Odelia backward, sending her crashing to her knees. Thorn collapsed heavily to the wooden floorboards. The sheer weight of his fall shook the foundation of the clinic. Dark, unnatural stains spread rapidly across his shirt, absorbing the candlelight around him. The dark magic of the spear acted as a catalyst. The demonic curse he had kept tightly restrained through sheer willpower was completely destabilized. The transformation process initiated immediately, vicious, painful, and entirely uncontrolled. His body convulsed violently as something untamed, ancient, and savage broke loose from the deepest corners of his soul. The temperature in the room plummeted further. Shadows swirled aggressively around his thrashing form, expanding to consume the light. Odelia crawled toward him, dragging her scraping knees across the debris, a desperate scream tearing from her throat. "Thorn, no!" He forced himself up onto one knee, his muscles expanded, his physical form shifting under his skin in a terrible, rapid mutation. The gentle scholar was dying. The apex monster was taking permanent, irreversible control. He lifted his head. His eyes were entirely feral now, blazing with a terrifying, untamed fire that threatened to swallow the room. The last remnants of his humanity were slipping away by the second, drowning in the dark. In a final desperate exertion of his fading rational mind, he fought the beast just long enough to look at her. His gaze was filled with devastating, heartbreaking clarity and supreme, sacrificing love. Run. Chapter 5. The command shattered against the freezing wind. Run. Odelia backed away, her boots slipping on the frosted floorboards. The transformation was complete. The fragile scholar had vanished entirely, consumed by the towering entity of the shadow wolf. It stood in the center of the ruined clinic. Its form was an overwhelming silhouette of dark, shifting mist and rigid, iron-bound muscle. Kaelin raised a trembling hand. The rebel commander tried to summon another surge of dark magic from his fallen position. He was entirely too slow. The beast did not roar. It did not display any frenzied, mindless rage. It moved with a devastating, dominant precision. The sheer velocity of the predator displaced the air in the room, creating a vacuum that stole Odelia's breath. A heavy, final impact echoed through the fractured walls. The rebel leader collapsed into the debris. His body went perfectly still. The remaining insurgents scrambled toward the shattered doorway, their weapons discarded in absolute terror. The shadow wolf pursued them into the night. Odelia knelt in the wreckage, her lungs burning with the sharp chill of winter. She waited in the crushing silence. The scent of copper mingled heavily with dark cinnamon and crushed pine needles. Every instinct in her human biology screamed at her to obey his desperate order. She had to flee. She was the vessel. Her existence anchored the darkness binding this realm. If she ran, perhaps the monster would spare her. A low, vibrating hum resonated through the floor. The predator returned. It stepped through the splintered threshold, ducking its vast head to clear the broken doorframe. The beast was majestic, terrifying, and utterly alien. Shadows wrapped around its titanic frame like a living cloak. It paused, inhaling the cold air. Then its molten red eyes locked onto her. Odelia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, erratic rhythm. The creature slowly turned its hulking body toward her. It took a deliberate, predatory step forward. The rational world dissolved. This was the entity that haunted the Black Forest. This was the curse that devoured the Alpha King's soul. It was a creature driven by pure, lethal instinct, stripped of all human restraint. It took another step. The wooden floor groaned under its crushing weight. She pressed her spine against the farthest wall. Tears of profound grief blurred her vision. He had sacrificed his crown, his peace, and his very humanity to protect her. He had willingly swallowed a demon's poison just to stand guard over a fragile, oblivious girl. And now, that same poison had erased the man she loved. Run! His final word echoed in her mind, but as she stared into those burning feral eyes, a terrifying clarity pierced her panic. If she ran, she confirmed his deepest fear. If she fled, she proved that he was nothing more than a monster. Her terror was the true poison. Her fear was the very thing severing the last thread of his human soul. If she abandoned him to the dark, the Alpha King would never return. Odelia stopped trembling. She pushed herself off the wall. Her knees felt weak, but she locked them into place. She wiped the freezing tears from her cheeks. The paralyzing ice in her veins melted, replaced by a sudden, fierce heat. The shadow wolf paused. It lowered its heavy head, emitting a deep, confused rumble. It expected prey. It expected flight. Odelia did not run. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the apex predator. The beast's ears flicked back. A warning growl vibrated from its chest, sending a wave of static pressure through the small room. It was a command to stay back. She ignored it. She took another step. "You told me to run," she whispered. Her voice was surprisingly steady. It carried through the quiet ruin, ringing with absolute conviction. "You told me to leave you." The distance between them narrowed. The overwhelming heat radiating from the wolf washed over her freezing skin. The intoxicating aroma of winter pine wrapped around her senses, pulling her deeper into his gravity. "But I am not leaving." She stepped directly into the predator's striking range. The colossal beast towered over her, its hot, ragged breath stirring the hair at her temples. It could end her existence in a fraction of a second. The danger was palpable, electric, and entirely suffocating. Yet Odelia felt no fear. She lifted her gaze, staring fearlessly into the molten red depths of its eyes. Beneath the feral rage, beneath the demonic curse, she saw the agonizing, trapped soul of her king. He was fighting a losing war in the dark, drowning in isolation. She reached out. Her bare fingers brushed against the thick, midnight fur of its chest. The contact sparked a violent jolt of electricity. The beast flinched, a sharp intake of air hissing through its fangs. It did not strike. It remained frozen, utterly paralyzed by her touch. "They said my life is a paradox," Odelia murmured. She slid her hand upward, her palm resting over the spot where the man's heart beat with that heavy, slow rhythm. "They said I am the vessel. They said my existence feeds your curse." The wolf let out a tragic, broken sound. It leaned slightly into her warmth, desperate for the tether she provided. "If I am your curse," she declared, her voice unwavering, "then I claim it." She did not wait for the beast to decide. Odelia took the final impossible step. She closed the microscopic gap between them. She tilted her head back, exposing the fragile, vulnerable column of her throat to the apex predator of the realm. It was the ultimate act of submission. It was the absolute pinnacle of feminine power. She was not a victim offering herself to a monster. She was a queen claiming her king. "I choose you," she breathed into the freezing air. "Even if the world burns to ash, make me yours." The shadow wolf shuddered violently. The primal, undeniable command of the mate bond eclipsed the demonic curse. The beast could not resist the absolute surrender of its destined mate. It needed to anchor her. It needed to bind their souls together before the darkness could tear them apart. The creature dipped its hulking head. Hot, searing breath brushed against her pulse point. Odelia closed her eyes. The strike was sudden, precise, and completely inevitable. Sharp pressure pierced the skin of her neck. There was no brutal tearing, only the profound, electrifying intensity of the claiming mark being sealed. A shockwave of pure, blazing heat exploded from the contact point, racing instantly through her entire nervous system. Her knees gave out. The mortal fragility of her human body could not withstand the cosmic weight of the bond. Her life force wavered, flickering like a candle caught in a tempest. She began to collapse into the shadows. Strong, familiar arms caught her before she hit the floorboards. The towering beast was gone, replaced by the desperate, trembling grasp of Thorn. He held her tight, his chest heaving as he buried his face in her hair. "Odelia," he choked out, his voice wrecked with agony and awe. She could not answer. The darkness was pulling her under, suffocating her consciousness. She was slipping away, her heart slowing to a fragile stop. But as her vision faded to black, the fresh mark on her neck ignited. A blinding, celestial light erupted from the claiming bite, illuminating the ruined clinic with the brilliance of a falling star. The absolute purity of their bond flared against the curse. The world vanished into a flawless, terrifying white. Chapter 6. The brilliant celestial light faded slowly into the freezing night. The shattered clinic fell completely silent, the absolute quiet pressing heavily against the fractured walls. The harsh winter wind whipped through the ruined roof, carrying the bitter chill of the black forest. Thorn knelt amidst the broken floorboards. His human form was fully restored. The demonic shadow curse had been entirely incinerated by the pure, unyielding power of the claiming mark. The dark magic that had haunted his bloodline was eradicated, but the ultimate victory meant absolutely nothing. Odelia lay motionless in his arms. Her skin was terrifyingly cold. The rhythmic, fragile flutter of her pulse had vanished entirely. The profound emptiness in the room crushed the oxygen directly from his lungs. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in the delicate curve of her neck. The golden glow of the bond flickered weakly beneath his lips, a dying ember in the overwhelming dark. He felt the hollow absence of her spirit, a void that threatened to swallow his sanity. "Odelia," he whispered, his voice fractured into a devastating rasp. It was the broken sound of a ruined monarch. He gathered her limp body close, rising to his feet with agonizing slowness. He carried her out of the devastated building, stepping into the untouched snow of the clearing. The world around them was painted in stark, silent silver. The brutal reality of his failure settled deep into his bones. He was the apex predator, the supreme ruler of the realm, yet all his iron-bound strength could not save his destined mate. Thorn dropped to his knees. The freezing snow soaked through his torn linen shirt, biting into his scarred skin. He did not care. He cradled her head gently against his collarbone, rocking her with a tragic, desperate tenderness. Then the Alpha King broke. A roar tore from his throat. It was not a command. It was not a display of dominance. It was an earth-shattering wave of absolute titanic grief. The sound violently displaced the freezing air, echoing for miles across the dark canopy. The sorrow shook the very foundations of the black forest, scattering the lingering shadows. It was a visceral plea to the heavens, a desperate surrender of his imposing soul. "Take me," he choked out, gazing up at the unforgiving starless sky. "Goddess, take my life. Let me fade into the abyss. Do not take her." He bowed his head over hers, his broad shoulders trembling violently. The sovereign ruler of their kind wept openly into the freezing night. He offered his crown, his vast power, and his very existence. He would trade the entire kingdom for a single solitary beat of her heart. The dominant monarch was reduced to a grieving man, stripped of all pride, laid bare before the universe. The profound silence stretched. The world seemed suspended in a vacuum of sorrow. Then a subtle shift altered the atmospheric pressure. A faint rhythmic vibration pulsed against Thorn's chest. He froze, his lungs locked tightly, his entire body going perfectly still. He looked down. The claiming mark on Odelia's neck flared to life. A warm golden luminescence radiated from the seal, weaving through her pale veins like liquid starlight. The lethal burden of the vessel had been entirely purified by his absolute devotion. Her sacrifice and his total surrender had triggered an ancient, divine reciprocation. The suffocating darkness had been eradicated by the blinding truth of their completed bond. Color slowly bloomed across her cheeks. The terrifying chill of her skin receded, rapidly replaced by a sudden rushing heat. The static energy in the clearing crackled with renewed vitality. Odelia drew a deep, resonant breath. Her eyelids fluttered open. Thorn remained paralyzed by awe, unable to process the miracle unfolding in his arms. Her eyes were no longer the fragile, fearful eyes of a mortal girl. A divine, untamed spark rested in their depths. The quiet, timid servant was gone. She radiated an imposing, quiet authority. She was entirely luminous, her presence expanding to fill the frozen clearing with an overwhelming, comforting warmth. "Thorn," she murmured. Her voice was soft but carried a confident, undeniable strength. She reached up, her warm fingers curving along the sharp, tense line of his jaw. The phantom static between their skin settled into a steady, vibrant hum of perfect harmony. The contact sent a jolt of pure salvation straight through his chest. "You are here," he breathed, leaning heavily into her touch, grounding himself in her reality. "You came back to me. I told you," she whispered, a gentle, powerful smile curving her lips. "I choose you." Before he could respond, a low collective rumble resonated from the distant perimeter of the clearing. Thorn shifted instantly, his protective instincts surging to the surface. He kept Odelia securely in his arms, his posture radiating lethal readiness as he scanned the tree line. From the deep shadows of the black forest, thousands of colossal wolves emerged. Their thick fur gleamed in the pale moonlight, their movements synchronized and brutally disciplined. The sound of countless paws compressing the fresh snow echoed like a rolling thunderclap. It was the royal army. The elite warriors of the realm had finally tracked their missing sovereign to the absolute edge of the world. The vanguard stepped into the open clearing. The soldiers shifted forms with fluid, silent grace, transforming into heavily armored commanders. Silver plating caught the ambient light, reflecting their elite status. They looked at the ruined clinic. They looked at their scarred, exhausted monarch kneeling in the snow. Then their collective gaze shifted directly to Odelia. The ambient pressure in the clearing changed dramatically. The seasoned soldiers sensed the celestial, towering aura radiating from her delicate frame. They felt the absolute purity of the completed mate bond wrapping around their king. She was no longer a hidden human. She was the supreme anchor of their leader's salvation. The divine energy she possessed demanded immediate, unquestionable respect. The lead commander stepped forward. The hulking warrior did not speak a single word. He simply dropped to one knee in the freezing snow. He bowed his head low, pressing his armored fist firmly over his heart. It was a gesture of supreme, absolute reverence. The movement rippled outward. Thousands of imposing, battle-hardened wolves descended into the snow. The entire royal army knelt in perfect, sweeping unison. The visual was breathtaking, an ocean of lethal warriors submitting without hesitation. They did not bow to the Alpha King first. They bowed to Odelia. They submitted to the new queen, acknowledging the staggering, majestic power of the woman who had conquered the shadow curse and saved their sovereign's soul. Only after offering their total devotion to her did they lower their heads further, acknowledging their king. Odelia looked out over the sea of kneeling warriors. A profound sense of destiny settled deep in her chest. She was not a victim of a cruel paradox. She was their light. Thorn looked down at her. The agonizing devastation had completely vanished from his features. A slow, incredibly tender smile transformed his aristocratic face. The dark burdens of his past were entirely gone, replaced by a radiant, unyielding peace. He stood up, his towering frame exuding effortless dominance. He lifted his queen high against his chest, holding her securely as the first brilliant rays of dawn broke over the jagged horizon. The golden morning sunlight spilled across the snow, washing away the lingering shadows of the long, terrifying night. From a high, frost-covered branch of a nearby pine tree, a black crow fluttered its wings impatiently. Finally, Pippin squawked, his beady eyes glaring down at the cinematic display of royal affection. I was getting completely exhausted with the two of you. Odelia laughed, the bright ringing sound echoing perfectly through the quiet, triumphant morning. She rested her head against the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of her king. Finally home. He was a king, feared, untouchable, unbreakable, and yet, for her, he knelt, not as a ruler, not as a monster, but as a man who chose her over power, over pride, over the entire world, and she chose him back, not the king, not the legend, but the darkness and the light inside him. For the first time in years, the sun touched his skin and didn't burn. For the first time, she stood beside him, not as prey, but as his Luna. But fate is never that kind, because when power like theirs is born, the world doesn't stay silent. It watches, it waits, and somewhere, beyond the borders of their kingdom, something has already begun to move. If you stayed until the end, you felt it too. This wasn't just a love story. It was a bond that rewrote destiny. Subscribe and stay with me, because their story doesn't end here. It expands, and what comes next will test a love powerful enough to shake entire kingdoms.